As we are everywhere, on every continent, in deserts, in jungles, on frozen tundra. How did this happen? We started in one place, as one small population of apes in Africa. The story of how we went from there to here is the story of humanity. It's a journey that took hundreds of thousands of years. It was driven by hunger, by climate change, by curiosity, and by conflict. It wasn't a single grand expedition. It was a slow, messy generation by generation creep across the face of the earth. To understand the journey, we have to go back to the beginning. Not just the beginning of our species, Homo sapiens, but the world we were born into. For millions of years, different types of human-like creatures, called hominins, had been evolving in Africa. They walked upright, they made simple tools, they were smart, but they weren't us. Our direct ancestors, the first anatomically modern humans, appeared in Africa around 300,000 years ago. The fossil evidence points to places like Morocco and Ethiopia. For a very long time, we stayed put. For over 200,000 years, we were an African species. We foraged, we hunted, we lived in small, mobile groups. We were not alone on the planet. To the north, in Europe and West Asia, were the Neanderthals. They were stout, strong, and incredibly well adapted to the cold. To the east, in Asia, were the Denisovans, a mysterious group we only know about from a few fragments of bone and teeth found in a Siberian cave. There were probably other hominin groups as well, ghosts in the fossil record we haven't found yet. The world was a lot more diverse human-wise than it is today. We were just one of several human types trying to make a living. What made us different? It's a tough question, and scientists still argue about it. But a few things seem key. We developed more complex symbolic thought. We created art. We made more sophisticated tools, like smaller, more refined stone points that could be attached to spears. Most importantly, we likely had more advanced language. This is hard to prove, but our ability to cooperate in large groups, to plan for the future, and to pass down complex knowledge suggests our communication was a game changer. It allowed us to build stronger social networks. A bigger network means more people to help you when times get tough. So why did we leave Africa? There was no committee meeting where a leader decided it was time to explore. The process was much more organic. Think of it like a puddle slowly overflowing. A family group might have a good year. They have more children who survive. Their little territory gets a bit crowded, so a few of the younger ones move over the next hill or into the next valley where there's more game or more edible plants. They aren't trying to conquer the world, they're just trying to find lunch. This process repeated itself for thousands of generations. Climate was a huge driver. Africa wasn't always the same. It went through long periods of drought and periods of wetness. During dry times, the Sahara Desert expanded, acting like a giant wall, trapping populations in the south. But during wet periods, the Sahara would become green, with lakes and rivers. These Green Sahara events created corridors, allowing animals and the people who hunt them to move north into the Sinai Peninsula and the Middle East. There were likely many small, early excursions out of Africa. We have found Homo sapiens fossils in Israel dated to around 180,000 years ago, and in Greece over 200,000 years ago. But these early waves seem to have failed. They were either pushed back by a changing climate that turned their new homes back into desert, or they were outcompeted by the established Neanderthal populations, or they simply died out. They were dead ends in our story. The big, successful, permanent migration out of Africa seems to have happened sometime around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago. A single group, maybe just a few hundred or a few thousand people, made the crossing. Genetic evidence tells us that everyone alive today who does not have purely African ancestry is descended from this one small founding population. We are all family, and that family reunion happens somewhere in northeastern Africa. This group didn't head for Europe. Europe was cold, and it was full of Neanderthals. Instead, they turned right. They followed the coast. This is often called the southern dispersal route. It makes perfect sense. The coast is a rich, reliable place to live. You have access to the land and the sea. You can hunt animals, gather plants, and also harvest shellfish, crabs, and fish. The skills you need to survive on a coast in one place are the same skills you need 100 miles further down. So, these early modern humans combed their way along the shores of the Arabian Peninsula through Persia and into India. They moved fast, relatively speaking. Within maybe 10,000 or 15,000 years, their descendants had reached all the way to Southeast Asia and were staring out at the open water towards a new continent, Australia. Reaching Australia was a monumental achievement. Even during the peak of the Ice Age, when sea levels were much lower, there was never a land bridge connecting Asia and Australia. To get there, our ancestors had to make a series of open water crossings. The shortest of these would have been dozens of miles. They didn't have sailboats or compasses. They likely used simple rafts made of bamboo or reeds. They must have been able to see land on the horizon, island hopping their way across. But it was still an incredibly dangerous and deliberate act. It tells us that these were not primitive people. They had the cognitive ability to plan, to build watercraft, and to imagine a world they could not yet see. They arrived in Australia at least 50,000 years ago, maybe even earlier. Once there, they spread across the entire continent with remarkable speed. They adapted to its harsh, dry interior, its tropical north, and its temperate south. This was the first time any human species had reached a completely new continent, one that had evolved its own unique set of animals for millions of years. The arrival of humans had a devastating effect. Australia was home to megafauna, giant kangaroos, marsupial lions, huge flightless birds, and wombats the size of rhinos. Within a few thousand years of our arrival, most of these giant animals were extinct. Was it because we hunted them? Or was it because we changed the landscape with fire, which Aboriginal people used for hunting and land management? It was probably a combination of both. We were a new, incredibly effective predator in an ecosystem that had never seen anything like us before. While one branch of the human family was settling Australia, other branches were pushing in different directions from that initial Middle Eastern hub. Some groups began moving north, into the vast open plains of Central Asia, and others turned west, towards Europe. Europe was a challenge. It was cold, in the grip of the last ice age. And it was Neanderthal territory. Neanderthals had lived there for hundreds of thousands of years. They were the original Europeans. Around 45,000 years ago, modern humans, our ancestors, began to push into their world. For a few thousand years, the two kinds of humans coexisted. We don't know exactly what their interactions were like. Were they violent? Did they trade? Did they avoid each other? The evidence is sparse. What we do know for certain is that they interbred. Most people today with European or Asian ancestry have a small amount of Neanderthal DNA in their genome, typically around 1 to 2%. This means that at some point, or multiple points, our ancestors met Neanderthals and had children with them. Those children were raised in modern human societies, and their mixed DNA has been passed down to us. We carry a genetic echo of these other humans. The same is true for the Denisovans. People in Melanesia, like the inhabitants of Papua New Guinea, carry up to 5% Denisovan DNA, suggesting significant interbreeding occurred as our ancestors moved through Southeast Asia. But this coexistence didn't last. By about 40,000 years ago, the Neanderthals were gone. They vanished from the fossil record. Why? It's one of the biggest mysteries in human evolution. Maybe we actively killed them off in a long drawn-out genocide, maybe we just outcompeted them. Our social networks were larger, our tools were perhaps slightly more efficient, and our population grew faster. A small advantage, maybe just a 1% difference in birth rates, compounded over 1,000 years, could be enough to replace an entire population. It's also possible that climate change put them under stress and we just happened to be the final straw. Or maybe we simply absorbed them into our population through interbreeding. Whatever the reason, after they were gone, we were the only humans left in Europe. At the same time, other groups were pushing ever eastward, across the vast, cold, dry plains of Asia. This was the Mammoth Steppe, an ecosystem that no longer exists. It was a huge grassland that stretched from France to the far east of Siberia. It was home to massive herds of mammoths, woolly rhinos, bison, and horses. For the people who lived there, this was an all-you-can-eat buffet, if you could survive the brutal cold and the dangerous hunts. To live in Siberia during the Ice Age required a whole new level of adaptation. Our ancestors developed new technologies. They learned to make tailored clothing from animal hides using bone needles to sew them together. They built shelters from mammoth bones and hides. They became expert big game hunters. They lived this way for thousands of years, slowly pushing further and further north and east following the herds. By at least 25,000 years ago, humans had reached the northeastern edge of Siberia. They were at the edge of the old world. In front of them lay a new world, a new hemisphere, completely empty of people, the Americas. Getting to the Americas was the next great chapter in our global expansion. During the Ice Age, so much of the world's water was locked up in massive ice sheets that sea levels were hundreds of feet lower than they are today. This exposed a huge bridge of land connecting Siberia and Alaska. This land bridge is called Beringia. It wasn't a narrow, icy corridor. It was a vast, 1,000-mile-wide subcontinent of cold, dry grassland. It was part of the Mammoth Steppe. For a long time, the standard story was that the first Americans, known as the Clovis people, were big game hunters who chased mammoths across Beringia down an ice-free corridor that opened up between the Great North American ice sheets and then spread rapidly through the continents around 13,000 years ago. But in recent decades, that story has fallen apart. Archaeological sites have been found all over North and South America that are much older than the Clovis sites. We have evidence of people in Chile 14,500 years ago, in Texas 15,500 years ago, and maybe even earlier. How did they get there if the ice-free corridor wasn't open yet? The new theory is that they didn't walk through the middle of the continent. They came down the coast. These people, adapted to a coastal life in Siberia, would have used boats to hop down the Pacific coastline. This kelp highway would have been rich in resources like seals, seabirds, fish, and shellfish. The coast would have been free of ice long before the interior corridor was. This explains how people could have gotten all the way to South America so early. Once they got past the ice sheets, the Americas were wide open. Two massive continents, full of animals that had never seen a human being before. The population exploded, people spread from Alaska to the tip of South America, Tierra del Fuego, in just a couple of thousand years. It was one of the fastest and most successful expansions in human history, and just like in Australia, the arrival of humans coincided with a mass extinction of megafauna. The mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, and short-faced bears that once roamed North America all disappeared. Again, the debate rages, was it the climate changing at the end of the Ice Age, or was it the new deadly hunters with their finely crafted spear points? The timing is just too suspicious. It was almost certainly us, or at least our arrival was the final blow. By about 12,000 years ago, humans had occupied every major habitable landmass on Earth, except for one. The most remote places on the planet were still empty, the tiny, scattered islands of the vast Pacific Ocean. The settlement of these islands was the last great act of human migration, and it was a very different kind of migration. This wasn't a slow creep over a land bridge or a desperate coastal scramble. This was planned, deliberate, deep-sea exploration. It was undertaken by a group of people we now call the Austronesians. They originated in Taiwan around 5,000 years ago. They were farmers, but they were also master boat builders and navigators. They invented the outrigger canoe, a stable and fast vessel capable of carrying people, plants, and animals across long distances of open ocean. Over thousands of years, they spread out from Taiwan, through the Philippines, into Indonesia and Malaysia. They sailed west all the way to Madagascar off the coast of Africa, and they sailed east into the Pacific. They settled the islands of Melanesia like Fiji and Vanuatu. Then, around 3,000 years ago, they made a leap into the unknown, into the vast, empty expanse of Polynesia. This was arguably the greatest feat of navigation in human history. These sailors had no modern instruments. They used the stars, the sun, the patterns of ocean swells, the flight of birds, and the shapes of clouds to find their way. They would sail against the wind to a new island, knowing they could always get home by turning around and sailing with the wind. They carried with them everything they needed to start a new life: taro, yams, breadfruit, chickens, pigs, and dogs. They were literally carrying their world with them in their canoes. From a hub in Samoa and Tonga, they spread out to colonize the enormous Polynesian Triangle. They reached the Marquesas in Tahiti, then sailed north to Hawaii, and southeast to one of the most remote pieces of land on Earth, Easter Island or Rapa Nui. The last major landmass to be settled was New Zealand, reached by Polynesian navigators, the ancestors of the Maori, only about 800 years ago. With the settlement of New Zealand, the human journey was complete. From our origins in a small corner of Africa, we had walked, rafted, and sailed our way to every corner of the planet. The whole process, from that first successful step out of Africa around 60,000 years ago to the arrival of people in New Zealand, took roughly 59,000 years. But the story isn't just about dates and routes on a map, it's about our species' defining characteristic: adaptability. We are not the strongest or the fastest animal. We don't have claws or fangs or thick fur. What we have is a big brain and the ability to cooperate. We survived the Ice Age not by evolving fur, but by learning to make clothes and control fire. Since we populated the globe not because we were physically adapted to every environment, but because we could create the tools and the culture needed to survive in any environment. This long journey also shaped who we are today, genetically. As small groups split off and moved to new places, they took only a fraction of the total human genetic diversity with them. This is called the founder effect. It's why genetic diversity is highest in Africa, where we have lived the longest. The further you get from Africa, the lower the genetic diversity of the indigenous population. The entire Native American population, for example, descends from a small group of founders who crossed Beringia. So, how long did it take to populate the whole planet? The short answer is about 300,000 years from the time our species first appeared. But the more meaningful answer, the story of our global conquest, really gets going around 60,000 years ago. From that point, it was a long, continuous process of expansion, of adaptation, of discovery, and sometimes of destruction. It's the one story that belongs to all of us. It's the journey that made us who we are. We are a species of travelers. We started walking and we never stopped.